Right here. Are we on?
Hey, it's Amanda Voisin.
Y'all are unmuted.
Hey, good morning. It's Earl.
Good morning.
Hey, Earl.
Hey, Pat, it's Amanda. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Amanda, we can hear you.
Good deal.
Is that John Boudreaux or Big Daddy?
John Boudreaux.
Hey, John.
Thank you, John. We're going to start in about 10 minutes.
Listen.
Okay. Did you get them? Send them a message.
Yeah, we're good on this 4-day work week, 10 hours a day. Off on Friday. I'm glad to go back on regular.
I know that's why I'm here, but I get the Friday and Monday off instead of every Friday. And then I work the next Friday. So I work 10-hour days, and I get Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. But you know, I don't think I've ever taken those days off. Always end up coming in.
Oh, he's talking, but he's muted.
I just leave my laptop when we on vacation.
Yeah.
Because it's public record.
Oh,
That
that's true.
stops.
Yeah.
It never stops.
Hey, Pat, I'm actually going to have to hop over to the Region 5 meeting, but I just wanted to say hello, and I'm sure that it's going to go great, and I'm glad that Reese is on and looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Appreciate
y'all.
it.
Take care.
All right.
Who did you work?
She's one of the consultants.
Miriam.
She's with the CSRS? Arcus? Arcadis, that's it.
Cast the thousands here.
But you're with the Franklin group still, huh? Okay, I got that.
What's Perry been up to? I haven't seen him in a long time. I think he still owes me a cigar.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm about to reclaim the host because I see that we are live on Facebook.
okay, yeah, we're gonna start in about 5 minutes. Just hang in there.
So,
Now you should hear everybody.
Don't need that. Trying to figure all this out. Let's see, close that. And participants.
See where that little phone deal is over there?
Hmm?
On the right. All the way to the right.
Yes?
Right.
Oh,
Oh, right there. Hit that. Or hit that little blue box. See what that says.
let's just give them their phone number on there. Yes. I mean, this is the first one since I had this new computer, so the other ones I tried getting in and couldn't. Yeah, a little bit. I don't know if any of them are speaking right now. I'm hearing some of them.
Hey, I'm on a webinar, Zoom meeting for LWI. It's starting in like 2 minutes, so if you have something.
No. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah.
Should be ready. At the volume, man.
Probably got an exit to the screen. I'm sorry, just leave it like that.
I don't think they started yet.
No, I don't think so.
What are you channel? Man, I need hearing aids so bad. I think I'm gonna just go back to that guy in New Orleans.
I need them. I need them.
What?
I need them too.
Okay, Mark, you ready?
Okay. We live? All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Black, the chairman. I'd like to call the meeting to order on this wet Wednesday. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Pat Gordon to call the roll.
When I announce your name, please mute yourself. Reply here. David Wheel with Ascension Parish.
Yeah, Pat, can you hear me?
Yes, David, that's you.
Yeah, I finally got a new computer so I can join you guys.
Good.
Okay, great, thank you, appreciate it. And John Boudreau from Assumption Parish. John, I saw
I'm
you
here,
there.
you're very mumbled, but I'm here.
Thank you, John, for joining us, appreciate it. Andrew Barron.
Yeah, I'm here, present.
Andrew.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
I'm here in attendance.
thank you so much, appreciate it. Okay, we're going to Iberia Parish. Scott Sonnier.
I am present.
Thank you, Scott. From Iberville Parish, John Clark.
I'm here.
Thank you, John. Good, here's, that's good. Thank you. And from Jefferson, Maggie Talon. Maggie, you with us?
Hi, good morning. I'm here.
Thank you, Maggie. Then from Lafourche Parish, Amanda Wazan.
Hey, I'm here.
Thank you, Amanda. And then from New Orleans Parish, Theo Sanders.
I'm here.
Thank you. From Plaquemine Parish, Richie Blink. Richie Blink. Okay, we'll move on to Point Coupé Parish, Mark Ward.
Good morning, I'm here.
Thank you, Mark. St. Charles, Earl Mathern.
I'm here.
Thank you, Earl. From St. James, Merrill McCary. I thought I saw Merrill on there. St. James, Merrill McCary. Okay. St. John the Baptist, Devin Boyle.
Good morning, I'm here.
Thank you, Devin. St. Martin Parish, Casey Corville.
I'm here.
Thank you, Casey. St. Mary Parish, Tim Mott. St. Mary, Tim Mott. Okay. And Mr. Black is here. And West Baton Rouge, Kevin Durbin. Kevin, you with us?
President Pat, good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Thank you, Kevin. And Kevin is our vice chair. Okay, Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum. We only have 3 that are not present.
Thank you, Mr. Garden. Thank you all for being here. The next item on the agenda is the review and adoption of the minutes of the May 27th meeting. I believe you all received an advance copy of the minutes prior to this meeting. So that being the case, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes as written.
This is Earl. I move that we accept the minutes as written.
Thank you, Earl. A motion by Earl Mathern to approve the minutes as written. Is there a second to that?
Seconded by Kevin Durbin, West Baton Rouge.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes of the May 27th meeting as written. Any discussion? Hearing none. Any objections to that motion? Hearing none, we will consider the minutes approved as written. Thank you very much. All right, the next item is a work plan amendment, and I'm going to turn that over to Mr. Garden to explain. Pat?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems like we're having a difficult time meeting on the fourth Thursday of every month. And as it turns out, that's also the meeting date of South Central Planning meeting. And so we'd like to change to the fourth Wednesday of every month. And I've spoken to several steering committee members that may be a better meeting date for everyone. So does anyone have any concerns with changing the work plan to reflect meeting date change to the fourth Wednesday of every month?
So this is Maggie from Jefferson. We have council meeting typically on Wednesdays. However, it's not always the fourth Wednesday. So I guess all to say I can make it work, or I can send somebody if necessary, if I need to be at council. But that's the only thing I have as a potential conflict.
Yeah, and y'all have y'all meetings during the day, Maggie?
Yeah, in fact, it's happening right now.
Right, okay. Well, if you could do that, that would certainly work. Thank you.
Absolutely. So does anybody else have any issues with the fourth Wednesday of the month for our steering committee meetings? Well, this would be a good time to speak up if you have an objection to it. If there are no objections, then we'll consider that to be our meeting dates, the fourth Wednesday, to be called by Pat Gardner. Now, I did skip over an item. I want to go back to it just briefly. I want to introduce Cassie Parker, who's going to go over some housekeeping issues with you just briefly. Cassie?
Yes. Good morning. Just a few of the housekeeping rules. In order to limit background noise, please mute yourself if you're calling in, or mute your microphone if you're attending via your computer. If you're calling in, please be sure not to place the phone on hold. Hang up if you need to take the call, because some agencies actually have music playing, which can disrupt the entire meeting. If you have any questions or you're having difficulty hearing the presenter, please utilize the chat box. And please make sure to type your name prior to your message. For those dialing in, you can call 985-851-2900, and they will be able to get in touch with us. And please let them know who you are, and we will try to fix those technical issues if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassie. Any questions for Cassie? Well, hearing none, we'll move to actually the next item on the agenda is the flood risk assessment presentation by Pat Forbes and Evelyn Campo. And we're going to move that item down on the agenda, I think because of its length. We want to make sure we get everything in. And we're going to go to the next item, which is committee members' comments and project inventory review. And I'm going to turn that over to Mr. Garden to talk about. Pat?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As y'all recall from the last meeting, we, and Cassie, could you get to the next slide, please?
I'm trying.
As you recall, we took all the projects that were submitted for round one within the watershed region 6 and utilized those projects as the beginning of our preliminary inventory list of projects. And from this list, we should see funding for projects from round one that the state will be selecting. I don't know how many projects they'll select from this list, but of course, once they're selected, they'll be taken off this list, and we'll be adding projects to this inventory list as we move along. And so the question becomes, how do we add projects to the Louisiana Watershed Initiative program is developing a portal that will allow communities to insert projects with background information on these drainage projects, and they will come to my office as the watershed coordinator, and we will enter those projects into the inventory list. So that will allow communities to insert projects with back. What do you say?
Repeat that question, please.
Yeah, I have to restart the whole thing.
Just, are we live? I mean, okay, yeah, just be patient with us for a second. We've got some technical difficulties we're going to work out here.
They can hear you though, y'all can.
They can hear me? Okay, let me just go through some of the bullet points regarding and some of the talking points. The regional project inventory is a comprehensive list of all watershed-related projects and plans that are planned, underway, or recently completed in the watershed region 6 area. Development in this inventory is a requirement of the Louisiana Watershed Initiative Regional Capacity Grant Building Program. The purpose of the inventory is to assist regional stakeholders in creating a common operating picture of what projects and plans are being proposed or underway. Also, compiling the inventory will also assist the future regional watershed coalition in the development of capital improvement plans and regional watershed plans. The inventory will be viewable as a map and a list and can be sorted or analyzed. The inventory will not be used as part of the application process or any funding award process. It is for discussions and analysis purposes. So who will compile the project inventory for the region? The regional watershed coordinator, that's myself, will, with the assistance of the members of the regional steering committee and other regional stakeholders, will compile the project inventory on behalf of the region. Each watershed coordinator and regional steering committee will work with the regional stakeholders and develop a plan for collecting the data, analyzing, and discussing it as a region. So when will the project inventory be completed? The inventory is a living document which can be updated as projects or plans are conceived. The regional steering committee will adopt the preliminary project inventory list and submit it to the Louisiana Office of Community Development in the fulfillment of the RCDG program requirements by October 31st, 2020. Also, let me remind you that the same list will carry on through the coalition once the Watershed Region 6 coalition is developed. And as we all know, this is a long-term planning process. So these projects will go, we may see this go 10, 20 years into the future. So this is a living document, and we look forward to working all of you on this project inventory list. And Cassie, if you can go to the next slide, please. And here you'll see where the Louisiana Watershed Initiative staff has mapped out the projects that were listed on the preliminary project inventory. And this survey provides a map viewer of the projects entered by region. Round 1 projects data have already started to be entered into the inventories. You can share these links to stakeholders who are interested in observing the development of this inventory. Throughout the next meeting, we will follow up with you by refining, editing, and adding inventories as projects input process is nearing completion. We will send out the links and information by entering projects in a follow-up meeting and review the process at the July meeting. So certainly we can address any questions that you have at this time regarding this, but this is to be discussed in detail at the July meeting, and we foresee the July meeting being another Zoom meeting like this because of the governor's extension of the COVID-19 situation. So Are there any questions on the inventory list survey?
Any question?
Okay, let's move on to round one timeline. Ms. Cassidy. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, will you handle this?
Yeah, go ahead, Pat. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, what we have before you right now is that we're looking at July 2020. Hopefully, the action plan will be approved by HUD, and then the deadline to submit project applications would be 3 months after that date. So following the application scoring, which would be possibly in September, the awards would be announced for the $60 million for the statewide projects. After that would be done by the Louisiana Watershed Initiative staff with the state. After that, the regional selection or the regional steering committee will need to make a selection of project or projects for $5 million, and we're estimating that to be October of 2020. That could be pushed back, but these are the timetables that we have currently.
Pat, if I could, this is Evelyn Campo with OCD. I just want to make sure we reiterate at this point that those timelines have already been pushed back because of the delay in receiving the grant agreement from HUD. And so we're still working with, these approximate timelines where, as soon as we get that grant agreement in hand, then the application phase for this program would open up. But because we're still waiting on that agreement, we're still kind of in a holding pattern with HUD. So just wanted to make sure to highlight that there's not a deadline right now to submit your application by July, because again, that application period will open up once we get that grant agreement. Just want to make sure we're clear. So y'all just let me know if you have questions.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. This is Mark. I want to ask you a question about when do you anticipate, or do you have any idea when HUD is going to sign the agreement?
Hey, this is Pat Forbes, Pat.
Hey, Pat.
We expected it by now. We think that we're in the last exchanges of information with them to get that final approval so we can sign the grant agreement. So we hope that it's just any time now, but again, we can't really start the clock until we get that approved by HUD and get the agreement in place.
Okay, Pat, this is Mark. When that agreement is executed, you're going to notify everybody, all the steering committees, that this has been done, and then reset the various deadlines. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Once that date is set, we can open the official application process for the projects.
Thank you, Pat. Does anybody have any questions about this?
I do. This is Kevin Durbin, West Baton Rouge Parish. I guess my question might be for Mr. Pat Gordon. Pat, what is the relationship of the project inventory to the round one applications? Are they the same list? Are we talking about two different lists here? I'm a little confused on that relationship.
Yeah, Kevin, that's a very good question. And that was a question that I posed to the state as well. But apparently there's going to be virtually no criteria to the inventory that we'll start submitting now. It can be a maintenance project, it can be any drainage project, but the round one of projects that were initially submitted did have criteria and did have to address watershed in multiple parishes and have a much broader scope. But what I understand, this list is wide open, and it'll be up to this board, this steering committee, to whittle this list down to see what projects would be most beneficial to the watershed as a whole for the submittal in October or November. Either projects or either one project or multiple projects. But that's my understanding, and Evelyn or Pat Forbes, if you have any additional comments on that, I'd appreciate it.
Hey, this is Pat.
Nicolette.
Oh, go ahead, Nicolette.
Okay, this
No, go
is
ahead.
Nicolette. I'm with OCD as well, and I just like to say that they are separate. They're somewhat interconnected because they're happening at the same time. But the project inventory should be thought of as something long-term. It's really the first time that your region is pulling together a wide list of everything that's out there, either in concept or maybe a project that was recently completed. And it's to help serve as the foundation for your future watershed plan or capital improvement program. The inventory is really an exercise in learning about what projects are out there and maybe identifying opportunities to combine projects, to perhaps change projects based on understanding of what's happening in other parts of your region. So that's the purpose of the inventory. The Round 1 program, again, has an aspect where the Regional Steering Committee will get a list of projects that are eligible but not chosen by the state. So you'll get a list of projects for Round 1, and you all will be selecting that a project or projects up to $5 million. So that's a separate program. They serve two purposes, but again, they both involve watershed projects. So some of the projects that were applied for Round 1 funding might be on your inventory. I hope that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. That was a very excellent explanation of how the two lists relate to each other, as well as to what the steering committee's role is going to be in selecting projects. Thank you very much, Nicolette.
Thank you, Nicolette, because
Yes.
that's a little different than what we had discussed previously, but it needed to be more refined than the previous interpretation. That's good. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, do we want to go to close out public, or do we want to give Pat's presentation?
Let's go to key dates. Well, we've already gone over the key dates, and we know those are up in the air. We're going to try to plan for the next meeting. Of course, that'll be the fourth Wednesday of July. It's going to be another Zoom meeting, and we'll be preparing with the Louisiana Watershed Initiative staff a presentation for the inventory list and the portal that'll be utilized, and we'll certainly circulate the minutes and incorporate any comments that are being made at this meeting, and we'll also take the comments from the risk and vulnerabilities presentation and incorporate that into the minutes as well. And that of course is going to continue with the watershed steering committee and the coalition. That'll be a living document as well. So just some upcoming events that are taking place that you may want to mark the calendar for is the Managing Floodplain Development through the National Flood Insurance Program is September 14th through 17th. And I believe that the state is to be putting that on as a possibly a Zoom meeting or a Zoom conference. And then in Houma, September 30th through October 2nd, currently, the floodplain managers are going to be meeting at the Marriott. I don't know if that date is going to continue either with the changing of the COVID-19 numbers. But anyway, that's just a couple of events that you may want to put on your calendar, and it'll be a changing, this could change overnight. We know that. And at this time, Do we want to open it up for public comments on any of this? Any of the information that has already been presented? And Cassie, are the mics open?
Yeah, they can, I mean, they'll have to unmute themselves to speak.
Hi, this is Kevin Durbin. I guess I have one quick public comment before anybody else jumps in here. Y'all, I just want to let y'all know Pat has been very generous in offering, while we're talking about dates, and offering to have future meetings on the north end of the watershed. Unfortunately, I had to turn down that offer to him yesterday because all of our facilities here in West Baton Rouge Parish still are operating on very limited capacity. So Pat and I talked yesterday about future meetings. We're just going to continue to do the Zoom thing unless there's some pressing reason that my colleagues in Iberville or Point Capee feel the need to have a meeting up here on the north end of the watershed. We're just still operating under very, very limited facility capacity. So I did turn that offer down yesterday. I just want to let everybody know that.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that because we are trying to reach out to everyone, all the parishes, and it's pretty difficult in this environment, but thank you for those comments.
Thank you, Kevin. This is Mark. I hope one day in the foreseeable future, we'll be able to have one of our meetings in West Baton Rouge Parish that you can host. Any other public comments? Well, hearing none, and then we'll move to the flood risk assessment presentation by Mr. Pat Forbes. Pat, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. Thanks a bunch, Mr. Chairman and Pat. First, I just want to acknowledge the commitment everybody has to this process by virtue of being on this meeting. I know that there's a whole lot going on. I know that local, state governments, all kind of entities are dealing with this COVID crisis, and I appreciate everybody's commitment to making it for this discussion today. It is super important. The purpose of today's presentation is really to talk through one of the key objectives of the Watershed Initiative, and that is using data, science, and engineering as the primary decision-making tools as we look at future flood risk. And so this presentation, the purpose of this presentation is to start to look at the tools that we have available, help us all start to understand the tools, the flood risks that they illuminate for us, the vulnerabilities and the priorities, because ultimately this is a collaborative process at local, state, federal level, private, public, you name it. And so if that's going to be successful, we have to make sure that we're all have the same common understanding of what the risks are, what tools we have, what our vulnerabilities are. So today we will be walking through introducing this tool, building some awareness, but please don't feel like we've got to have a bunch of answers today. This is really just the first part of an ongoing conversation. Few notes. This is a public meeting. I think that Mr. Gordon went through all this already, but just to remind everybody, it's being recorded. All these notes and slides and video will be available upon completion on the website. There will be a closed caption version on YouTube that people can go back and look at if they like. Linked on the South Central Planning and Development Commission and the Watershed Initiative website. Everything that gets entered into the chat will be recorded and part of the public record. We've set aside an hour and a half for this. If we don't need that much time, of course, we won't use it. We just wanted to make sure that we leave ample time for everybody's questions to be adequately answered. The other thing is, as we're going through this, because we are doing this meeting remotely, we think that it will be a lot more effective if the RSC members, just if you have questions, comments, additional information to add to help illuminate the conversation, please just jump in and contribute that while we're going through this. There's no need to wait till we have some specific feedback prompts throughout the presentation, but if you have questions or comments while we're going, please just jump in and provide those. Okay, next slide, I think, please. So it's also critical as we're talking about collaboration and the way that this works and the way that all these organizations are going to have to work together for this to work, for everybody to understand that everything we're talking about today and everything that we will continue to talk about is really building on previous efforts of those in Region 6 in this case. We've already worked with and learned from professionals across the region. This is not something that we put together to show to you. This is something that essentially came from you that we've compiled so that everybody can look at it together at one time and in one format so that we can all understand it in the same way. The priorities, the purposes here are clarify what flooding means. It has a few different meanings that we'll walk through. Align capital improvement plans to increase long-term project viability. This goes back to the list you were discussing earlier. But we got to make sure that whenever we're all investing money, that we're doing it in a way that those things make sense together, not just individually. Assess existing investments in protection measures. There are lots of things in place, especially in y'all's region, as you know. Let's make sure that we understand those, their benefits, and how the things that we might do in the future could cross impact with those. Make sure that we're using data, and not just data, but the engineering that uses those data and the science to evaluate the impacts as we're thinking about projects in the future. That's the distinction that we have now. That's the extra tool that we will have, is being able to know what the impacts are of the things that we're thinking about doing. And then in the end, if we have all these data, these tools, this engineering, we can make sure that we're relying on expert knowledge to separate politics and policy so that we're making the best decision for the whole region. Next slide, please. So how are we going to roll through this today? We're going to give this presentation on flood risks. Should take about 45 minutes, maybe less. Sometimes I talk too fast. If I do, please slow me down. And we will explain a few of the data sets that we have available right now and discuss how those illuminate risk in the region. If we need it, we'll take a little break and come back and recap, and that should take about 30 minutes or so. A few things that I would like the steering committee members to be thinking about while we're going through this presentation. One, that we're going to show a bunch of different data sets, or a few different data sets here. Do those accurately and completely reflect your understanding of the region's risk profile? Are there other data sets that you think would help us more accurately understand the risk profile of the region, including vulnerabilities? Are there opportunities where there are natural resources that can be leveraged for flood risk reduction that we might not be aware of or might not be taking into account? And are there other concerns that we just haven't addressed here that you might have relative to flood risk? So we'll move to the first slide of the presentation. So this tool we're going to show you is about flood risk in Region 6. And what we've done is create essentially a map-based story for Region 6, which allows all of us together the ability to look specifically at smaller areas in the region as we are talking about risks, so that we can see them and understand them together, but also for you to help point out things to us that we might not be aware of. We know how much work has gone into flood risk reduction in Region 6 already. I mean, there is, I'm sure there are things that we don't know about, but we know that it has been top of mind for folks in the region for a long time. We want to make sure that everybody benefits from that, and that you can benefit to the maximum extent possible from the tools that we're going to show you here today. You've already heard from Evelyn Campo. She works with Watershed Initiative at OCD, and she'll be assisting me today too as we go through these slides. And as will Nicolette Jones, who is on with us too, and also Ian Trahan from DOTD. So, as we have looked at each watershed region around the state, it is quite clear, and obviously probably clear before, but every region is unique. Every region has specific geographies, risks, population, demographic differences, and so every single region has to look at those for themselves and figure out what the priorities are for them. Of course, as we're doing this, we have to build a common vocabulary around flood risk, one of our objectives today. Make sure that we're considering a number of risk factors. There are different types of floods, there are different types of risks, and there are different people who are affected by these risks in different ways and to different degrees. So we want to make sure that as we go through this, we rethink together what the traditional solutions are that we're considering, as well as other solutions and approaches that we may not have considered in the past. Some of you are very familiar with the content that we're going to cover today, at least parts of it, going back to the fact that you folks have been dealing with flood risk for a long time. Forgive us for covering things if we do that you're already really familiar with. But next slide, please. So Region 6, you can see the list of parishes there. I won't read them all off. You know who you are, but it stretches from Point Coupee all the way down to Western Plaquemines Parish. And we want to make sure that we recognize that this is a big step for all of us to start looking at flood risk from this regional perspective, from this watershed perspective, is new for all of us, and this is a huge step. And again, just acknowledging all of you for taking that step and recognizing the value in it. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. Region 6 has a couple of big watersheds in it. What we're going to be talking about here is basically hydrology, which is how water circulates through the environment and through different pathways and at different rates. It flows across the land, it flows under the land, it flows in channels, and all of these things have to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about the hydrology of a watershed. And Pat, Adam, I'm wondering, I know this is a unique watershed, as are they all, but I'm wondering if you guys have any particular perspectives on Region 6 and the watersheds within it.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. Yeah, Region 6 is a unique watershed area, but it's easily defined in that Region 6 extends from the eastern bank of the Atchafalaya to the western bank of the Mississippi River. But most of the tributaries that were at one time attached to these major rivers have now been blocked, except during times of high water, and some spillways are open, but most of the tributaries have been blocked off from the major rivers. But the drainage design within the watershed is certainly interesting. In the northern sector, you see mostly gravity drainage that follows the contour of land. And in the southern reaches of the watershed, you see most of that being levied and pumped, which is called forced drainage, because of the contour of the land is flat, and water doesn't drain unless you pump. But some of the traditional approaches to mitigating these drainage situations have been implementing best practices for floodplain management in elevating, relocating, doing buyouts of structures, retrofitting commercial structures. And also, we highly recommend that anyone in Louisiana purchase flood insurance, because you never know who's going to be in that event. It's not just special flood hazard areas. And Mark, do you have any comments on that?
Well, thank you, Pat. You did mention some things about Region 6 that we've been dealing with flooding issues for a long time, and speaking for Terrebonne in particular, yeah, that's true. And we have developed, we sort of taken, to the extent that we can, sort of a holistic approach to drainage issues in Terrebonne, acknowledging the fact that we are impacted by drainage from other parishes. That's just a fact of life. I mean, we're at the bottom of the food chain, so to speak, and water's flowing from up north all the way out to the Gulf, and we just happen to be the last parish before the Gulf, in addition to Lafourche on our east. So yeah, we're dealing with it. Lafourche is dealing with it. St. Mary is dealing with it. That's just a fact of life. But Mr. Gordon does bring up some good points that I think the benefit of having this organization, and particularly a coalition, we'll be able to develop some best practices that perhaps could be put into place in other parishes, or at least get other parishes to begin to think about what they do with their water. It's not just a question of getting rid of it as fast as you can, because eventually it's going to impact us down here. But how to deal with water in a way that makes sense, so that it's not just a drainage issue. You know, water can be very beneficial. So we need to look at things like that as well. So, Pat, do you have any other comments?
No.
Can I interject something? This is Andrew Barron with Barataria Terrebonne National Estuary Program.
Go ahead, Andrew.
So yeah, I wanted to add to what Pat and Mark were saying about the uniqueness of our region down here. This is a very interesting area, and so in our region, compared to maybe perhaps other regions, we get, since we're very flat, you know, in the southern parts of it, we're actually in a distributary system in the southern portion of this region. Okay, so in the upper part of the region, you have smaller waterways that flow towards the larger waterways. But in our southern region, actually the larger waterways flow towards, or water flows away from the larger waterways. So for instance, Bayou Lafourche, the way the land was built originally geologically, the largest or the highest areas of land are actually near your major bayous and rivers, okay? And that's what forms actually our hydrologic boundaries. We have the Barataria Basin that's actually separated from the Terrebonne Basin with the Lafourche Ridge, okay? The other thing is that because we're so low lying and near the coast, this causes something, a phenomenon called bidirectional flows. Okay. The reason that we have so much forced drainage down here is because water flows in both directions. So we go out and collect water quality data at several different locations in 2 watersheds twice per month. And in one of the watersheds in particular, which is the Bayou False watershed that drains from Thibodaux through Lockport, you can actually see the water flowing. We were out there just last week, and the water changed directions in flow 3 or 4 times at various different sites as we were going down through collecting our transect data. And so that provides a very, unique problems for the parishes down here in terms of flood protection, okay? Another thing I want us to keep in mind is that the fresh water that, just like Mark was talking about, it's not just all about drainage. If you go in and, a lot of people have the perception that we need to just dig our drainages deeper. Well, if you have bidirectional flow, that means that the water is going to flow faster in the other direction up into the northern parts of the system. So for instance, the Barataria Basin is a completely open basin currently. There are plans right now through the Corps of Engineers to build a federal levee system right along the Highway 90, across the basin. But currently there's no gates or anything stopping the water flow. The water flow, this reverse flow signature, can be seen all the way up in north of Lac des Allemands, okay? So that's all the way up in the northern part of Barataria Basin. So again, if you go in and do a bunch of drainage work and dig, dredge out everything in the upper parts, throughout your basin, whenever you have these reverse flows, that's going to be farther up that water can move up into the system. That includes saline waters from the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so that's all things that we need to be thinking about. Another thing is fresh water from some of these projects. So for instance, one of the projects that the Barataria Terrebonne National Estuary Program, or BITNEP, had promoted many years ago in our comprehensive plan. We have a comprehensive conservation and management plan, was called stormwater redirection. Okay, so as Mark was talking about, we have a forced drainage throughout all of South Louisiana, or Southeast Louisiana, throughout Region 6. We have forced drainages in place. So we have levee systems, and of course, like any levee in South Louisiana, if you don't have a pump on it, it's going to fill up with water. So we have pumps all along these levee systems. Last time we did a survey of stormwater pumps, there were over 256 pumps throughout our whole system, throughout the Barataria and Terrebonne system, which corresponds with Region 6. And as part of this project I'm talking about, you can do miniature little diversions or wetland assimilation projects at the outfall of these stormwater pumps. This is just one example how storm or drainage system projects can work in conjunction with coastal restoration and protection. Levees, in order for those levees to be protected and intact, we really need our coastal wetlands also intact, okay? These are just thoughts, concepts I want y'all to be thinking about as a committee as we move forward, looking at projects, looking at things really from a large scale. This is some of the things that BITNEP has tried to capture in the past, and moving forward with our CCMP, our comprehensive management plan, because we need to take into account, our coastal wetlands, which help to protect us from hurricanes, storm surge, some of these reverse flows that I'm talking about, the bidirectional flow, in addition to our levee system and drainage network. And so thank you all for letting me speak. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew. I agree with you 100%, but let's, Pat, Forbes, Mr. Forbes, do you want to continue?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And thanks. Those perspectives make it even clearer why a watershed approach to flood risk management is so critical. So thank y'all all for that perspective. Moving to the next step, we're going to talk about the different types of flood risk now that Region 6 faces. I'm going to go through 4 different types, but then we're going to delve into each one a little bit more deeply. First is coastal flooding, which you all are very aware of. In Louisiana, our primary disasters in recent years have been around hurricanes, tropical storms, storm surge, essentially. In addition, there are types of flooding associated with heavy rainfall. Riverine or fluvial flooding is essentially when a river overflows its banks because of rain in the watershed of that river that overwhelms the capacity of the river or bayou to carry the water. A third kind that is a little bit different and sometimes hard to distinguish is what's called pluvial flooding. And that's just from a really heavy rainfall event that doesn't necessarily overflow the banks of a stream, but rather overwhelms the capacity of a drainage system. Whether it's an urban or suburban built drainage system, it overwhelms the capacity of that and you get localized flooding. And that can be very, very damaging. And then speaking to the uniqueness of Region 6, there is also backwater flooding that you face in the lower reaches of the region, mostly associated, actually throughout the region probably, mostly associated with high levels in connecting water bodies that can push water in different directions. Going back to Andrew's point earlier, the water can flow in both directions and you can get this backwater flooding. And again, I'm going to ask Pat and Adam, anybody else there to reflect a little if there are other examples of that you might want to touch on.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. I believe that Mart and Andrew have kind of touched on that backwater issue also, but you know, many of our parishes, especially the river parishes, are affected by backwater flooding. And with these high water events along the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya, we've seen high water events in St. Mary, the backwater high water events in St. Mary and the western portion of Terrebonne Parish. And in Assumption, Pierre Port has had high water this whole past year. So backwater flooding is a big concern with us, especially when the rivers are high. Mark, do you have anything else?
No, that's good. That's exactly correct.
Okay, thank you.
Continue, Pat. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, then I'm just gonna move forward to each of the types and get into a little bit more detail on them. First, of course, is coastal flooding, which is driven by surge and tidal effects. Again, the thing that we're all most familiar with. Because we have been impacted so heavily by storms and had so many disasters and so many ill effects from this, you're all quite aware that the state has invested heavily in the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority and the Coastal Master Plan. And consequently, we probably have the best in the country, if not the world, data, engineering, and science associated with our coastal environment and coastal flooding, not to mention the lessons that we've learned from previous efforts and previous disasters. The next Coastal Master Plan is due to be updated in 2023, and in fact, that work is ongoing right now. But it's important to note that it is not just about reducing flood risk, but promoting sustainable ecosystems, providing habitat for a variety of commercial and recreational activities coastwide, strengthening communities, and supporting regionally and nationally important business and industry. In other words, it's not just about stopping flooding, it's about how do we adapt to this? How do we do that in a way that we protect and preserve the culture of the state's coast? How do we do that in a way that protects and preserves the economy of the state's coast? So it's really a multifaceted plan, and it's super important to keep that in mind when you're thinking about the master plan. So the other thing to note, because of what I was talking about earlier, the data and the engineering that we have, we also have at our disposal for coastal Louisiana future predictions of flood risk. And what you're looking at on the screen there now, it will take just a minute to load up, I think. But what we're able to do is consider future sea level rise scenarios, as well as what you face in coastal Louisiana is subsidence of the ground, and to be able to do some predictive modelings of future flood risk. If you look at this map, and you can see that slider going back and forth across the map. And what you're looking at, the difference between the left and the right side on the slider, is the difference between the 1% or 100-year storm and the 0.2% or 500-year storm. And the reason this is important is just to recognize that we can have bigger storms. We are subject to bigger storms. In fact, storms are getting more intense and more frequent. And we do have some risks that are greater than that 1% annual event that we all think about when we think about our FEMA maps, which we will discuss a little later in the presentation. Hurricane Isaac in 2012, which I'm sure most of you remember, that was a storm that was about a 1% storm, or the 100-year storm in terms of rainfall and storm surge. But what this slide helps us do is basically see the increased risk when we go to 500 year. And again, I'll turn to Pat and Adam and ask if y'all have any other input.
Yeah, Pat, the frequency of flooding, the 100-year, the 500-year, of course, are depicted on our federal flood insurance maps, and many of our communities have been using those maps since the 1970s, 1980s, and those maps are being revised. They've been appealed by some of our parishes. We're expecting these maps to be finalized sometimes in the end of this summer or in the fall. But that's going to have a huge bearing on developers, because right now developers don't know where they should be developing subdivisions or building a house, because they're unsure of these 100-year, 500-year floodplains. So this could be a huge benefit to development in our areas, to either enhance or take away from potential developments in these areas. But yeah, thank you, Pat.
Yeah, thanks. So a key takeaway from this is we have in Louisiana essentially better information than any other coastal area in the country, because of all this work, all this engineering, all this money, frankly, that's been invested in understanding the risks better than other places have been able to do, or have taken the opportunity to do. CPRA, it's important to note, is a partner in the Watershed Initiative. They are one of the 5 agencies in the Governor's Watershed Council, and it's important to know that what I mentioned earlier, we are gathering information and learning from the experts within each region. At the same time, we know that there is great expertise in not only the engineering and data, but in the approach that we can gather from CPRA and their approach to coastal flooding. And that is absolutely wrapped up in the Watershed Initiative. We're trying to make sure that we learn from everything that DOTD, CPRA, everybody else has done in the past to help reduce flood risk. All right. At this point, I'm going to open it up to the members of the steering committee and pose a few questions for you relative to coastal flood risk. I guess specifically, is your community using the surge data and information to inform your mitigation activities, and how are they doing that? If not, so what sort of obstacles do you think there might be to that? Are there any places in particular that anybody would like us to zoom in on here and run the 100-year versus 500-year wand over it? Any other feedback?
So Pat, I'm from Assumption. So a bit of comment on the surge data, and as you know, I do multiple tasks here in Assumption. Some of that information in regards to surge data that was developed by NOAA, and we use it for our particular storms as we ramp up to make good decisions. Some of that is not that accurate as you get inland. And the example I give you is an Assumption in the worst case scenario, Category 5 storms has a 25-foot storm surge, which would cover the entire parish with a small portion of the Bellerose area that it would not.
Mm-hmm.
Even the Hurricane Andrew single runs show storm surge flooding inland in the Lake Verret Basin. And using the real data that has occurred, it is nowhere near that because it's hard to model that far inland when you have the terrain that we have around us. So I don't want to get caught up on the storm surge stuff. It's very accurate directly on the coast, but it's not so accurate when you get that far inland. So I do appreciate it, and I have to use it because, God forbid, anything would happen to anyone in regards to flooding. But I want to be careful when you get inland with using that data.
Sure. Thank you. That's good perspective. That's late. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, so, and it's all good data. That backwater flooding, storm surge is all a big deal because it stacks up against the Atchafalaya levee. I know that. I experienced it over my career, but it doesn't, at the levels that the modeling data shows, it doesn't get that high when you get that far in there.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Okay, if no other questions or comments, feedback, we're going to move on to the other three types of flooding that Region 6 is subject to. First is, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to explain one thing before we jump off of this map, if that's okay.
Sure.
We are going to make sure that this link is available to everybody in the meeting so that you can explore this tool on your own. And so if you have questions about, like, where does this data come from? What exactly is this telling me? You know, those type of things, just let us know. You know, because one thing that I think is interesting to keep in mind about this map when you're looking at it kind of on your own is this is showing a future scenario projected 30 years into the future with the CPRA master plan implemented, right? And this is showing you flood depth on the ground. This isn't showing you like the projected height of the surge. You see what I'm saying? So just want to make sure that everybody, you know, realizes what we're looking at here, and just let us know if you have further questions. And with that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Thanks, Evelyn. That's great clarification.
You know, Pat, I just want to bring to your attention also that the CPRA parishes in the coastal master plan, actually there's 20 parishes within the coastal master plan, and 14 of those parishes are in our watershed. So there's only 2 parishes, West Baton Rouge and Point Coupé, that are not in the CPRA master plan. So that there's going to be a lot of overlapping, which is good. We can share information.
Yep. So to that point, thanks a bunch for bringing that up, because I want to go back to something about the modeling that we're doing and how it is going to have effects in this region, and that is that in addition to the riverine modeling and hydrology modeling that we're doing all over the state, part of the watershed initiative is also to do that transition model that's never been done, that blends the riverine models, the hydrology and hydraulics from uplands with the storm surge models, so that we can get for that transition zone the impacts of both of those simultaneously. So it's going to be another important addition to the engineering and science community of information once we get through with this. Okay, I'm going to move on to flooding that's caused by extreme rainfall. And the first one of those is riverine flooding, or also known as fluvial flooding. You can see what you're looking at right now is a map of the rainfall from, is that Isaac? No, 2016, I'm sorry, 2016, yeah. One important thing to understand is that the gray and dark gray, that's the heaviest rainfall, not the red, yellow, purple. So my first inclination was to read it the other way, but the heaviest rainfall is the dark gray on there. So as we're thinking about extreme rainfall events, we all know this about Louisiana. It's extremely flat. We are subject to as much or more rain than anybody in the country, and so we are subject to the risks associated with extreme rainfall events and the flooding associated with that. 2016, for instance, some of those gray areas got over 10 inches of rain. So it's certainly a risk we've got to consider as we are thinking about how do we protect our communities from the risk and how do we stay resilient. So I'm going to, go on again to fluvial flooding or riverine flooding. Essentially, that's what happens when you get rain in a watershed and the amount of rain that flows to the channels overwhelms the capacity of those channels, whether it's a river, a creek, a stream, a bayou, but it's usually from water falling in the watershed and then overflowing the banks of the river. We see that more in more upland environments, not quite as much in the types of environments in Region 6. The next...
Hey, Pat, this is Kevin Clark Ever. Can I make a comment?
Please, jump in.
Look, I appreciate what Andrew, the explanation about bidirectional flooding down in the lower end. And, you know, the region starts at the top up in Point Capede near Morganza. you know, the elevations up there are anywhere from 30 to 40, 50 feet. There is a little bit of riverine, you know, type system up there. But as you come down the system, Point Capee, West Baton Rouge parishes between the two levees, Atchafalaya, Mississippi, kind of bottlenecks down and flows through Iberville. So we received the riverine type flooding, and we're also in a unique or sour spot in the region where we also are subjected to backwater flooding in that bidirectional flow. The land elevations in the lower part of Iberville Parish is 5 foot to 2 foot. And in fact, we recently had to replace a lot of our benchmarks in the parish because they had subsided as much as 1.5 feet.
Wow.
So, so we're working with the levee district down there on the Bayou Shan to, you know, with the barge to prevent backwater flooding from wrapping around and flowing up Bayou Buff, which there's a USGS flood station there. You can see the negative flow occurring. I mean, it can get as high as 10,000 cubic feet per second flowing upstream.
Yep.
And as water's coming down from the top, Point Capee Parish, West Baton Rouge Parish, and Iberville Parish, it's meeting head on with that water coming up from the bottom. So I just wanted to throw that out there. We're kind of like stuck in the middle of, you know, a bottleneck where we're getting the top and the bottom.
Yep.
And it really gets to a point where the water has nowhere to go.
But I want to thank you again for that perspective, and it's just yet another opportunity for us to all see how critical it is that we be working on these issues together, because everything any of us does affects all the others. So appreciate it.
Thanks, Pat.
The next type of flooding that's associated with extreme rainfall is pluvial flooding. And the map you're looking at right now is in West Baton Rouge Parish. Pluvial flooding is, as I said earlier, associated not so much with rivers overflowing their banks as it is more urban and suburban drainage systems just being overwhelmed by a rain event, a localized rain event. So we saw a lot of this in 2016 all around the state. The map that you're looking at right now is those dots that you can see. I don't know if you can zoom in on that. Those dots are FEMA individual assistance applications for assistance due to flooding. The important thing to note here, if you look at the light blue shading to the bottom left of this slide over there and then up a little bit from there, those are the areas that are in the special flood hazard area within this picture, in the 100-year floodplain, in other words. So you can see all this flooding of structures and homes that occurred outside the 100-year floodplain due to an extreme rain event. So this is absolutely a critical source of flood risk for all of us. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Pecan Acres in Point Capee Parish, where we're moving a whole community up there, and that's all about that drainage system being overwhelmed. So anyway, that's a third type of flooding that we have to keep cognizant of as we go through this thought process of evaluating risk. The fourth type is backwater flooding. I think that we have heard a lot of different perspectives on backwater flooding already. I think everybody understands that well. Essentially, it is, y'all have said it better than I could in describing it. Does anybody have any questions about backwater flooding or additional comments? Would anybody like to jump in at this point before we move on? with any other comments, questions about fluvial or backwater flooding. And again, this tool is going to be available for you to use and zoom in to your communities. I think that's accurate, isn't it, Evelyn? Same tool,
That's
right?
correct. Once you zoom to a certain extent, though, just keep in mind those dots disappear, right? And that's on purpose. That's not a glitch. That's, you know, to keep some of this data relatively aggregated and anonymized. But you can still, you know, use the tool to kind of see clusters and to see your flood zones and where you're having, you know, those damage clusters from 2016.
Okay. All right, well, we're going to move on. The next slide is traditional gaps in understanding flood risk. And essentially what we all have and rely on right now are FEMA's flood maps, right? We understand what they represent. We also understand their shortcomings. And this is not throwing FEMA under the bus. FEMA understands their shortcomings. FEMA is a partner with the state and with the regions in this watershed initiative. They're great partners. They have great expertise and great data, but they also recognize that the purposes of those flood maps they create are very specific, as well as the fact that many of the maps are outdated in the state. I think we've got something like 56% of our maps in the state are outdated. So we got to recognize the limitations of the FEMA flood maps, but also the value that they provide and in fact, what they are. What they are is a basis for flood insurance rates and floodplain management regulations, basically. And the way that they provide that is by providing what we all understand, what we all call a 100-year storm inundation map. And that's what that means is 1% chance of a storm that would create that level of flooding in any given year. The important thing to know about that, everybody thinks, well, 1 in 100, that's never going to happen to me. Over the course of a 30-year mortgage, there's a 26% chance that flooding would occur at a specific site, your home, let's say. So understanding that risk is bigger than 1% as we think about the course of our lives is critical to understanding the risk that flood maps show us. It's also worth noting that 92% of Region 6 is in that 100-year flood zone. The map you're looking at right now, you can see the light blue shaded areas are your 100-year floodplain. And I believe that the darker blue, the really dark blue is water, of course. You can recognize the lakes, but the darker shade of blue between the two are what are called V zones. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the two of those now. A zones are, of course, what we were just talking about, the 100-year floodplain, 1% chance in a given year. V zones are much higher risk. They're either subject to coastal high hazard flooding from surge or a velocity flooding next to a waterway, say. They are almost always next to waterways or next to the coast. And the idea there is that they would be subjected not only to rising water, but flowing water or waves. And so the risk is much higher, insurance is much higher, and it is, in fact, FEMA and HUD don't allow development in V zones. They don't allow their money to be spent in V zones. That's how much higher the risk is. All that said, FEMA's flood maps are critical to us all. Many of you, I know Pat is a planner. We understand that if people have to have some understanding of what their risk is. And this 100-year flood map is what we have to do that right now. It tells us where are the safer places to develop. What do we need to do to make sure that development is safe in our communities? And they provide those values. What we're able to do now, though, with the additional modeling that we're going to do and the additional modeling that CPRA has already done along the coast, is think about future flood risks. And that's when we have more intense rainfalls, when we have subsidence of our land, when we have rising sea levels. What does that increased risk look like? Because we all always want to have the best information we can have as we're making plans. And so that will be the ongoing mission of the Watershed Initiative, is to continue to improve the quality of the information that you have at the local level to make decisions around those issues. Development, what's safe, where do we build? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide and talk about repetitive loss. Repetitive loss is tied directly to those flood insurance rate maps. And what it involves is essentially structures that have had multiple claims against their insurance. In the case of repetitive loss, it is at least 2 claims in a 10-year period. There is a further designation, severe repetitive loss, that's had 4 or more claims of at least $5,000 over that period. I think it would make sense at this point to see if Amanda or Maggie would want to weigh in and help educate us a little more about RL and SRL properties.
Hey, this is Amanda with LaFouche. I guess in terms of how we use the RL and SRL data on a day-to-day basis, the list itself is pretty confidential, but when we as a parish can kind of identify any hot spots or areas that, we are constantly addressing and sending, parish resources out to address, we know when to coordinate with our public works department, our drainage department, our planning department, and kind of strategize in terms of where we place our infrastructure, our pump stations, where we focus, heavier kind of drainage on the front end. And in terms of planning, we can keep track of kind of our current and future development, just making sure that we're not exacerbating any other, flooding anywhere else in the parish. So we kind of use that data to kind of prioritize and strategize in terms of where we're placing our resources on the parish level.
Yeah, and this is Maggie from Jefferson. So to kind of continue with what Amanda was saying, in addition to those things, we also use the repetitive loss list to help us prioritize who we will do outreach to whenever an FMA or HMA grant cycle opens up. So it can help us determine who is eligible for FEMA grants, whether it's elevation or reconstruction. The thing to note, though, about this RL list is that there have been some recent changes as far as how they're able to disseminate this list. Typically speaking, each community would get an updated list every year, and that would normally come from either FEMA Region 6 or for those communities that participate in the community rating system, that would come from your ISO specialist. In the past, probably 6 to 8 months, possibly longer, there have been some issues with looking at personally identifiable information, or PII is what they call that. Because this, as Amanda mentioned, this list is often protected due to the Privacy Act that FEMA has in place. And I think they've kind of come across some concerns of if this was getting shared with possibly people that it wasn't intended to be shared with, and so forth. So there's now something in place called an information sharing and access agreement that a community can submit to FEMA. And what that does is allows FEMA or ISO to provide that community updated list. So many of you probably haven't gotten an updated list since 2018. This is kind of the background as to why that's the case. And so if you do need an updated list, I'm happy to try to make connections and figure out exactly where to get that list, that agreement from, so that you can get that signed by either your office or your administration and get that submitted back to FEMA so they can release those newer lists to each community. And just another quick note for anybody who is in fact participating in CRS, outside of helping to prioritize, potential grant recipients or applications, it's also helpful to work through several CRS activities. The one that comes to my mind is activity 510. And this is looking at, for instance, either your floodplain management plan or your hazard mitigation plan. And if you are what they call RL category C, that means if you have 50 or more repetitive loss properties for your community, there's a requirement here within the CRS program that you need to send out a mailer to everyone within your repetitive loss area on an annual basis, and possibly do a repetitive loss area analysis. So there are some other requirements specifically to CRS communities that make this RL list pretty critical. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Thank you. Thanks a bunch. It's very helpful. Okay, the next thing that we are going to do is, other comments? Okay. Next thing we're going to do is basically look at a case study, and that's the March and August 2016 floods. A few things to note about this. You can see again the 1% light blue shaded area in the region. And you can also see in this data set those yellow dots, which represent FEMA individual assistance claims from the 2016 floods. And that means that they flooded, their homes flooded during one or both of those floods. There were 1,180 homes impacted in Region 6 in 2016. And the important thing to look at on this page is that many, if not most, of those properties. Could everybody mute your phone, please, if you're not engaged in talking at the immediate time? Thank you. You can see that those impacted properties are, for the most part, not in the floodplain, which is pretty scary, but it helps draw attention for all of us to the fact that FEMA's flood maps are about setting insurance rates, development codes, those sorts of things. They don't necessarily perfectly describe risk. They certainly don't describe future risk. And so I'm going to go back to something somebody said earlier, which was everybody should buy flood insurance. That said, this is a perfect, perfect indication of what we're looking at. This is up around False River, northern part of the region, and you can see all the flooded properties that are not in the 100-year floodplain. So it's quite clear that understanding our risk associated with flood goes far, far beyond understanding the FEMA flood maps. Okay, I think that if going to take a pause here and see if anybody's got any comments, feedback on that. Any areas you'd like us to zoom in on. And again, this map is available for you. This tool is available for you to go take a look at and zoom in on specific areas that you're concerned with.
Pat, this is Cindy O'Neill. Can you hear me?
Yes, Cindy, go ahead. Thank you.
I would just like to make a comment about those IA spots that are not in the special flood hazard area. I would also venture to say that those areas that are not in the 100-year event on those maps were not necessarily regulated by those communities because they were outside of the special flood hazard area. And this is also an indication that we need to be enforcing some higher standards. If we have flooding areas that we can see are a problem, we need to be enforcing a higher standard in that area to protect those areas of our communities.
Yeah, it's a great point, Cindy. We have, even on the FEMA flood maps, there's 500-year floodplain, but that has no impact on development in most communities at this point. But it's certainly a tool. It's a thing that communities can use to better understand their risk and potentially increase the restrictions on development there, or the protections for development there.
Pat, this is Kevin Durbin, West Baton Rouge. Cindy, I appreciate your comment. I just want to point out one thing, because a lot of those dots are in West Baton Rouge Parish, and it's not anything I'm taking personally. I just want to present some data to you here. We do have higher standards in West Baton Rouge Parish. In fact, that's one of the things we get a lot of credit for on our CRS rating. The problem with this, Cindy, is that that particular event was somewhere between the 500 and 1,000 year event. And so then the question becomes, to what event do you set your standards at? And I don't think any of us were prepared for this 500 to 1,000 year event. So that would be my only comment on that.
I agree wholeheartedly with you. I mean, there's always going to be a higher event, and that's the reason to have flood insurance.
Yep. It's a great point, though, Kevin, that, yeah, the 2016 floods were historic in so many ways, not the least of which is that, like you said, in many areas, they were 500 to 1,000 year storm. Yeah, and this is not throwing stones at the people who flooded out. I mean, you know, was a tragedy for everybody. It's just to make sure that it's clear that we face risks that may not be indicated, that are not indicated strictly from a FEMA flood map. And so that's sort of the work of the Watershed Initiative and the councils, is to better understand what those risks are as we go forward. What additional tools do we need to make sure we understand that risk as well as we can, so we can be as prepared as possible?
And I applaud the communities within Region 6, because most of them do participate in the CRS and enforce higher standards, and they're very proactive in helping their citizens prevent flood losses.
Any other comments or questions?
You know, Pat, this is Evelyn. One thing that I would be interested to hear from the group, if y'all have input on it, is a lot of the data that we have, you know, when we look at our rep loss data and, you know, things like IA claims from past events, a lot of our data is looking backwards, and it's based on, did water get into a structure? And I think one thing that would be really interesting for the steering committee is to think about, okay, have we also had some events where it was like a near miss, right? Where we thought we might get some damage claims, maybe the water came up in a downpour, but then it didn't actually get into the structure, you know, and those may show you some risks that our damage data doesn't highlight.
Yeah, great point.
I'd also like to point out one other, FEMA did an analysis of the structures in 2016 that received flooding, and if Louisiana had adopted the American Society of Civil Engineers recommendation to adopt a 1-foot freeboard, we would have had 50% less flooding.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's important to note a good half of the properties that flooded in 2016 were not in the 100-year floodplain, about 50%. So, okay, we're going to move to the next slide. And this is about the best practice of working with nature. The one thing that as we go through this, and no matter what region we're in, and no matter what research we read, we understand that it is more and more evident that it's going to be impossible to just build our way out of flood risk and into resilience. That a huge part of what we're going to do is going to have to be learning to work with nature. Part of that process is using existing wetlands and storage areas to slow down the travel of water and consequently reduce flooding where we are developed and where we do have people living. And the beautiful part about the natural approaches to reducing flood risk is that they have multiple benefits. I mean, we all know Louisiana is a sportsman's paradise. Whenever we create more natural systems that help reduce flood risk, we're also enhancing the natural environment, wildlife habitat, water quality, the innumerable additional advantages to reducing flood risk. But first and foremost, it's probably the single most effective thing we can do to reduce flood risk in most parts of the state. And again, I'll throw this out to anybody who would like to share anything specific relative to best practice of natural landscape.
Yeah, Pat, this is Pat Gordon. I think that brings up a good point of using wetlands for our reservoir from drainage, but we also need to look at some of the prime property as reservoir, because so many times you need to expand on a existing drainage canal or create some reservoir banking in a particular area, and they're not in wetland areas. So it's not just in wetlands that we look for our retention ponds.
Okay.
Bring that to attention. The greatest impact to a forced drainage system is having the retention pond in non-flood hazard, in wetland areas.
Okay. Thank you. All right. We are going to move on now to our last data set to cover today. This is what you're looking at right now is an indication of social vulnerability, and this may not be a thing that you've heard of before, but can I ask everybody to mute your phones again, please? Thank you. It's critical when we're thinking about flood risk and the risk on the community that we understand that flooding is not just flooding of places, but it's flooding of people. And what the social vulnerability index helps us understand is the pre-disaster condition of the folks living in our region. Social vulnerability index is created by Centers for Disease Control, and it's just one way of measuring vulnerability. And when we talk about vulnerability, of course, there are lots of pieces to think about there. Income, age, disability, minority status and language, housing, transportation. And what the SOVI does is give us sort of a compact way to understand those things whenever we're thinking about flood risk. If we know the geography of the flooding, we can overlay that with the geography of our vulnerable populations and get a clearer picture of where we're putting the most vulnerable people at the most risk. You can see on this map, the darker shades represent areas with higher concentrations of socially vulnerable people. And that's where we need to recognize that if they flood, in fact, they have a lot harder road to recovery, and consequently our community has a lot harder road to recovery than an area that is not as socially vulnerable as that area might be. This is also a tool that you're going to be able to access and see. Now these are census tracts. If you look at the boundaries of the different colored areas, those are census tracts, and the bigger areas are less densely populated. The smaller ones are more densely populated, and you probably can pick out the communities. So I think everybody can agree, whenever we think about flood risk, we first start looking at water levels, then we start looking at structures, we've got to look at businesses, we got to look at people, and how do we make sure that how do we minimize the overall damage to the community? That's really our charge here, and understanding social vulnerability is critical to that charge. And it's super important to note that this is not the be-all, end-all to understanding community risks, right? So all of you are way more familiar than we could be, or the Centers for Disease Control could be, with where your vulnerable communities are and your critical infrastructure and all those other pieces that help us understand real flood risk. So I think it would be great exercise for each of you to go look through your community through this map and then think through what are the pieces that might not be captured here in CDC's SOVI map. Anything else we should be aware of in your region, in your community? Can you identify areas that have both high flood risk and high social vulnerability? Because that'd be particularly at-risk community for purposes of our work. Okay. Well, right now in our agenda, we are scheduled for a break. I can't speak for anybody else, but I would absolutely love to have about 5 minutes if that works for everybody else. Or do we need 10? Pat, is that what would y'all prefer?
5 or 10. Huh? 5 or 10 minutes.
5 minutes.
Okay, great. So we'll reconvene at 11:55 then.
Good.
Good.
Great, thank you. Okay, is everybody back? Pat? I'll let you run that, sorry.
I'll go get them and they'll come back, okay?
That's okay. Y'all schedule.
Okay,
We're
they're
here,
back.
Pat.
Oh, do we think we've got all the other members of the steering committee back?
Not sure. Well, let's checking.
It looks none of them logged off. It doesn't look like.
Yeah, it looks like we all.
It looks like we have everybody, Pat.
Okay, great. Well, let's get rolling. Just a little bit more to go, really. We covered a bunch of different data sets here, a bunch of different concepts about how to look at the risk that Region 6 faces, and we just want to go back and recap the pieces so that we can make sure if anybody has any questions, comments that they haven't put forward yet, that they can do that. One, we covered the 4 different types of flood risk that Region 6 faces. The fact that our current mapping and flood risk understanding don't necessarily reflect our future flood risk. A little bit better understanding of the special flood hazard areas on FEMA flood maps and repetitive loss properties, what those mean, what they might represent for us in terms of risk. The impacts of the great floods of 2016, the benefits of natural approach to flood risk reduction in terms of wetland areas and others, and then the social vulnerability index and how that affects our overall community risk when we think about flood risk. That concludes the presentation for my part. If anybody has questions or comments for me, please post them in the chat, or you can ask them now by unmuting your phone.
Let me, am I open? Yeah, let me say, Pat, let me thank you and Evelyn, very much for that presentation. It was nice to see a presentation on the many aspects of flood risk here in Region 6, basically in one place. That was, I think, very helpful. I think it will be useful for us as we give thought to what happens in our own particular parishes in the region. So with that, if anyone has any questions or comments, please get in right now.
And y'all, just to kind of make sure you know we have this available as you're giving comments, we have this last screen up, and we can zoom into anywhere that, you know, someone wants to talk about, and we have our flood zones shown on top of the satellite imagery and the IA clusters, and then I also have a slider that will show you social vulnerability under that. So if you have a specific area you want to talk about, we can zoom into it and see, okay, where are your flood zones, where is your damage, and then pull this over and what is the social vulnerability level. So just want you to make sure you know that as you chime in.
Thank you, Evelyn. Any comments? Questions?
we can open for public comment. We're open for public
Yeah,
comment.
we're open for public comment.
Don't y'all have a public comment period coming up at, I think, right now, is that right?
Correct. Yes.
But before we go to that, can I ask, Ms. Risa Muller has been on the call with us, taking notes, and Risa, I was going to turn it over to you in case you had any specific notes that you wanted to mention here before we move on.
Yeah, and I'm gonna change her to the host, so we'll be sharing her screen, okay?
Okay.
Risa, I think you're muted.
Yes, she
Can
is.
you,
She's muted.
well, can you hear her from here?
Can you hear me from the microphone here?
Oh, I see what you're doing. You're good.
It's magic. You should be able to hear from the group microphone here, yes. Okay, so what we'd like to do is quickly recap the comments that everyone provided on the presentation that Pat and the group just provided, and make sure that it's captured everyone's information accurately. Remember, they can email additional comments to watershed@la.gov, whether they're from the public or from the committee, on or before July 2nd, and mark it Region 6 flood risk in the subject line. And all the comments will be included in the meeting minutes. We just want to hit the highlights on the comments that we did capture, and hopefully you can read through this with me. On the hydrology comments, the changes in tributary geography over time were marked. The northern sector's gravity drainage compared to the southern sector's forced or pump drainage was brought up. The mitigating factors and the various versions of those were mentioned. And the relational drainage compared to the different sectors of the region were brought up. Andrew with BitNet mentioned the bidirectional flow, especially related to Bayou Falls watershed, and the unique issues related to flood protection in that manner. He mentioned that freshwater isn't all about drainage, and that there's been some unique approaches created related to that at BitNet. Surge data and coastal risk issues. Many of the communities in this region have used surge data in the past to inform their mitigation activities, and developers are anxiously awaiting the updates that will be coming out on surge data. But John in Assumption mentioned that surge data in the inland areas is really not as useful as one would hope, and we have to watch out for that. Pat Gordon mentioned that the CPRA master plan does overlap with most of Region 6, and that is an excellent resource going forward. In the fluvial, and backwater flooding topics, Iberville area mentioned that they are rather stuck in the middle of this region with multiple flooding risks, with backwater, bidirectional, and riverine issues. The repetitive structure data, the note was made that no structure falls off the RL list, so we really need to be very planning. The FEMA flood zones, modeling tools prompted the discussion of what standards should be in place for our community protection. And on the working with nature area, we need to consider expansion of wetland space. So it's just a quick recap. We want to make sure that everyone definitely takes email going forward additional thoughts. Pat?
We're going to go ahead and conclude this meeting. Just want to let you know that this will be on our website. We will have the next meeting will be in July, the fourth Wednesday.
July 22nd.
July 22nd,
at
correct.
10 o'clock.
Will be the next meeting, and we'll do another Zoom meeting like this. And we will have the minutes on our South Central Planning website. Anything else, Alan? Okay, Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, are there any public comments at this time?
Yes.
Well,
Go ahead.
May I proceed?
yes.
Hi. I'm Beryl Gomez. I'm from the Bell River Lake Barrette area, part of a 400+ group that's advocating to try to understand what has happened to the waterways in our watershed along the Bell River and Lake Barrette. The gentleman from Iberville Parish spoke, I believe, about the issues occurring from Morganza all the way down to flowing through Bayou Buff. Our goal as a group, and we are looking so much forward to working with everyone in this membership and others with some other state programs to find out what has occurred in the last 5 years to have raised our water levels that won't drop to the levels that preceded those 5 years, putting all of our properties at a higher risk, which wasn't evident before. A lot of members of our group are lifetime multi-generation residents that have firsthand knowledge of the history of these waters. We know that the waters are not getting out at Bayou Buff. We suspect that projects may have had some negative impacts, not intentionally, but may have. And we feel that the Bayou Chene project will not resolve the current impeding water flow. So we just want to work with whomever's willing to work with us to try to understand the modeling, any data that's out there, and work towards finding out what can be done to the stream from Morganza down through Bayou Buff with all of our parishes that can correct the situation we're currently under. So we look forward to it. Thank you for letting me make the comment.
Thank you very much for those comments. We have your name. We see you have the lady's name, contact information.
Yeah.
Good.
See on our email list.
Good. Thank you very much. Interesting comments. Anyone else from the public with a comment? Well, any last minute comments from any of our steering committee members? Well, if not, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Yes, Earl, so moved.
Thank you, Earl. Is there a second?
Andrew Barron, so second.
Andrew seconds. So we have a motion and a second to adjourn. Are there any objections to that? Hearing none, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, guys. Y'all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, y'all.
All right.
How many times do you have to get leave?